So I'd like to introduce our invited speaker, Kilu von Prince. So she received a PhD in 2012 with a grammar of Daca, later published under De Gruyter in 2015, a language which you will shortly hear more about. She is currently at the University of Berlin as a postdoctoral scholar and has recently accepted a full professorship at the University of Dusseldorf. Her work bridges the divide between careful documentary fieldwork and equally careful theorizing based thereon, while her talk today focuses on a particular interest of hers, namely tense and modality. She has broader interests in morphosyntax and the typological implications of this work, as well as on best practices for elicitation and fieldwork. In other words, she is, as the title on her website describes, a linguist in many senses of the word, with a broad variety of interests spanning multiple subfields. Kilu's talk today is about an oceanic-centric approach to tense and modality. And with this said, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'm super excited to be here, at least virtually. I wish we could all be in one place, but maybe next year. So yeah, I'm going to report today on some of my recent work on tense and modality and the relation between the two. And this talk is supposed to give you a bit of an overview and hopefully a bigger picture of how everything is connected. If you'd like to get into the nitty-gritty details of that work, you can download a lot of my papers online. So we have a recent manuscript that we've submitted with Anna Krajinovic and Manfred Krivka that you can download from my homepage. My Counterfactuality and Past paper is an open access publication with Linguistics and Philosophy. You can also just follow the link and download it from there. And especially those of you who might want to do field work on temporal and modal meanings in your subject languages, I would recommend that you look up our paper on mapping areality, which you can find at the Proceedings of Linguistic Evidence if you follow the other link. So the slides are on the homepage. You can just also look them up there and follow the links from there as you go. Okay. And I'm going to start this talk with a little bit of storytelling. All the things that I'm going to present on today started with really my fieldwork on Daca and Daca Lion, which are spoken in Vanuatu, and in particular the island of Ambra, which you can see in a blown up version here. So in Daca, which I'm going to report on today, is spoken in this region of the island, which has several language communities distributed along the coast. And this started in 2009 in the context of my PhD. And one of the many really interesting properties of this language is its tense aspect modality system, or TMA system, that initially from the start appeared to be centered around the realis-irrealis distinction, this really binary divide that you find in a lot of languages in the world, especially maybe in Oceanic, but also in a lot of other language families. So this is an example from an Arawakan language that's been reported on in detail by Lev Michael in 2014. And one of the first things that you notice, usually if you're faced with a realis-irrealis system in a language, is this fundamental divide between the past and present on the one hand, as opposed to the future on the other hand. And often you really see this binary division between past and present on the one hand and the future on the other hand. This is illustrated by this example from Nanti, where you have two sets of verb forms essentially. This comes with a realis suffix here, and in combination with the imperfective marker refers to the actual present, she's coming now. And in contrast to that, you have this complex irrealis marking to refer to the future, she will come tomorrow. So this is one of the really hallmark properties of a realis-irrealis system, this division between past and present as opposed to the future. Now, this divide is in the relation with tense and modality is mirrored by a similar asymmetry when it comes to the relation between time and reality. And this puzzle goes back at 2,000 years. So there's this, the classical reference is the sea battle example that's been ascribed to Diodorus Cronus, who was probably alive during the 4th and 3rd century BC. And the essential observation here is that imagine today's day 1, and today someone says there will be a sea battle tomorrow, and compare that to someone saying 2 days from now, on day 3, there was a sea battle yesterday. On the face of it, these should be two symmetrical situations. Both people are talking about the same day, both people are talking about the same event. And yet there seems to be a difference, a fundamental difference in the reality status or truth value of these utterances. When I'm here, when today is day 1 and someone says there will be a sea battle tomorrow, I really have no way of evaluating that claim as being definitely true or definitely false, right? There might be a sea battle tomorrow, and that might be the most likely outcome given our current knowledge, but we really cannot tell with absolute certainty. And to the extent that we can say anything with absolute certainty, if someone makes a statement about the past, by contrast, there was a sea battle yesterday, if we have enough knowledge about the world, then we should be able to confidently say, yes, this is true or this is false, with a different degree of confidence compared to the statement about the future. And this is independent from sea battles or whatever event you're going to talk about. There will be a conference in present with everyone present next year. You know, this might be the case or not. We can't really say with absolute certainty. Now we have learned this year again that the future is really open and unsettled. But the past and present, they're settled. Something either happened or it did not happen, and we can have a certain degree of certainty about that. Okay, so there's this asymmetry. And this has been kind of solved, this puzzle, at least during the 50s and 60s of last century by work by Arthur Pryor, among others, which has then been fleshed out by Richmond Thomason and others. Where the basic proposal is that, you know, yeah, the past is settled until now. That means it's a complete linear order until now, but maybe not after. So maybe time is not generally this complete linear order where for every 2 moments you can always say whether one is before or after the other or identical to it. But maybe that's only the case up until the actual present. And after that, you have more than one possible continuation of that timeline, and you will only know in hindsight which one of those turns out to be reality. And applied to the sea battle example, we might think of it this way. So if person A, for example, says today there will be a sea battle tomorrow, and there's at least one relevant future, if we're charitable, where there is a sea battle, then maybe that statement is at least not completely false. We can later fight about the truth conditions and felicity conditions of assertions about the future, maybe how many futures should be there with a sea battle in them for this to be felicitous, but at least it's not completely off the mark. Whereas if this is person B and in her past there is no sea battle yesterday and she still says there was a sea battle yesterday, this is just plain false. So this can account for this asymmetry between the settled past and present as opposed to the future. So here we seem to be dealing with very similar problems, really, when we look at the philosophy of time and when we look at, in language, realist, irrealist systems. This is probably a good approach to look at those systems. And that's why when I started working on the TMA markers of Daca, and I was like, how hard can it be to figure out their semantics? Like a long time ago. Manfred Krifka, my then supervisor, suggested that I look at this approach of branching time and start working with that. Now, the interesting thing is that in Daca, if we only look at modal temporal divisions and differences encoded in the TMA system, it's not a binary system. We have a 3-way distinction. not a binary one. And I thought, great, because there's a really easy way to expand the traditional branching time model to create exactly this three-way distinction between the actual, the counterfactual, and the possible. And my reviewers pushed me to choose a label for this approach, and I chose 3D modality, and now I'm stuck with it, I guess. So if I refer to 3D modality, it just means you have a three-way division between the actual, the counterfactual, and the possible, as opposed to a binary division between the actual and the possible. And then while I was working with this, I thought, like, this is really cool because we can actually, like, suddenly you have three instead of two domains. And that's turns out, I think, to be a very powerful innovation, in fact. And you can do a lot of other things with that. So today I'm also going to talk about two more puzzles that you can solve with that, which is on the one hand, the relation between past and counterfactuality, which has been observed in a lot of languages, that these two are often encoded by the same markers. And then the whole question, there's a whole set of questions around how does counterfactuality and how do conditionals relate to those classical modal expressions such as must and might and can and should? Is counterfactuality just another modal flavor, or like exactly how do those relate? And there's an entire set of puzzles that can be addressed through this lens, I believe. So that's the plan for the rest of the talk. So I'm going to walk you through the TMA system of Daca, because this is where it started. So when we look at modal temporal distinctions in the system, we find this three-way division, basically. We have a positive and a negative realis marker. We have a positive and negative potential marker, as I call them, and we have the distal marker. We also have two other markers. One, I call it the open polarity marker. It's restricted to embedded polarity questions referring to the actual past or present. So very specific and going out of style, but it's more concerned with polarity than with modal temporal distinctions, so I'm not going to talk about it today. And the change of state marker MWET, which also in terms of its temporal modal value is essentially identical to the realis marker. It just comes with the additional spatial value of change of state. So I'm also not going to talk about it today. So if we look at the realis potential and distal marker, the realis is entirely expected, entirely a regular realis marker. So Namyan store can mean I went to the store, I've been to the store, I go to the store on a regular basis. These would be the most usual interpretations of a sentence like this, depending on the context. Then Daca Potential, if you use it on its own, as in 3, in the let's dive, it expresses a directive. If you use it in combination with the assertion marker ka, a grass will grow next to our house. That refers to the future, so it's just a statement about the future. It can also talk about the possible generic present, as in 5, its head is white, I think. And then the super interesting distal is used to refer to the discontinuous past. I have a paper about that. There should be a reference at the bottom of this page as well, also freely downloadable. So life before was easy. This is continued by life today is hard. So something used to be the case is no longer the case. This is discontinuous past. And then the other reading that it gets is counterfactuality. Here we see a present counterfactual context. You feel it is like its skin existed. It feels as if it had a skin. And it's also used with past counterfactuals as in 8. If you had married this man, you would have been very rich. These are the contexts where you, this is from the fortune teller storyboard. Ask me about storyboards if you're interested in what we used for our research. And this illustrates that you use it for past counterfactuals as well. Okay, so wrapping this up, the realis is used to express actual events of the present or past. The potential marker refers to future events, also possibilities of the present. And the distal marker refers to the actual discontinuous past and also counterfactuality. So these were the observations basically that I started out with. And then I had this branching time framework to work with. And the one thing that I did to the traditional approach is, in fact, make one less assumption about how this works. So in addition to this basic formal definition of this partial order on indices or world time pairs, in addition to that, there is a restriction in the traditional approach that we can only quantify over those branches that run through the actual present. That means if I2 here is your actual present, you can quantify over all the predecessors, all preceding indices, and you can quantify over indices on B3 and B4. You cannot, in that case, quantify over B1, B2, B5, and B6, or any indices on those branches. If you want to still do that, you can quantify over those by pushing your perspective backward to a point in the past, let's call it I1, and then quantifying forward. And then suddenly those branches are again accessible, and you can quantify over B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, and B6. But what you cannot do in this case is quantify only over those branches that are accessible from I1, but not I2. So you cannot single out B1, B2, B5, and B6 to the exclusion of B3 and B4 in the traditional setup. Because from here, seen from here, these are not accessible. These don't exist. And from here, they are not distinguishable. Seen from here, all those are just possible continuations of your present. There's no privileged future here that is more real than any other future. They're all the same, right? So in the traditional setup, you always only get this binary distinction, actual versus possible. And what I did was to just lift that restriction and say, let's not just quantify over branches that run through the actual present. Let's say I'm here and I can directly look back to the things that could have happened but did not happen. And that's what I actually do with natural language expressions. And then I work with this picture, which is a little, looks a little different. So it's not this broomstick shape that you usually find in the context of branching time, the branching time literature, where you have one line of developments leading up to the actual present and then it branches off, but it's branches all the way down. And then it's actually really easy to define 3 domains. So the actual past is just all the predecessors of the actual present. The possible future is all the continuations of the actual present. And you have the big realm of the counterfactual, which are those indices that are neither predecessors nor successors of the actual present. And that's it. That's the whole trick. And then I took this and together with my then Berlin team, we used some existing storyboards and created some new storyboards to go back to Vanuatu and do more elicitations to get a really fine-grained picture of how these different languages encoded tense and modality. Yeah, this paper is on 6 languages of Vanuatu, where we did this really detailed mapping of temporal modal markers. And what I found for Daca is that there is no one-to-one correspondence between realis, distal, and potential on the one hand, and the actual, the counterfactual, and the possible. It's a little more complicated than that. So the actually the realist marker is absolutely well behaved in Daca. It has not given me any trouble since I started with the language. It only refers to the present and the actual present, the actual past, nothing else. The distal marker overlaps with it in that it also refers to the actual past. It also refers to the counterfactual past, and it can refer to the counterfactual present. And the potential marker can refer to the possible future and the counterfactual future, and also both the actual and counterfactual present. Okay, it did not end up being a one-to-one correspondence, but at the same time, the setup allowed me to come up with a really detailed and very, very fine-grained definition of those meanings of TMA markers that allows me to derive all their actual interpretations and the way they relate to each other, and a way to understand the whole system that I did not have before. So that worked out quite well. And as long as I stuck with talking about these small oceanic languages, I got a lot of good feedback and a lot of encouragement from prominent semanticists. But then I started saying early on, maybe too early on, you know what, you can also take this approach and throw it on languages like English and German and other languages, and solve a couple of really puzzling observations there. And that's when I started getting a lot of pushback, and some people got actually really angry with me for doing that. So yeah, but anyway, this next part, I got it published, so I'm probably not entirely crazy, or this approach isn't. The last one, I haven't written it up yet, so you be the judge. You can still stop me now from going ahead with it. So yeah, the next puzzle that is related to it, and we've already seen that we have this past counterfactuality connection here in Daca, right? So actual past, counterfactual present. And this is something that people have observed early on, also about English and about a lot of other languages, that you can use what has been described as past markers in situations that do not refer to the past, as in 10, if Aslam trained harder, maybe over the coming years, he would be stronger. The trained here is in what everyone refers to as simple past, the simple past form, right? But it does not refer to the past at all. In fact, in this particular context, it cannot refer to the past. So that's kind of troubling, that's puzzling. The other thing that we need to explain when we deal with things like this is the counterfactual implicature, which is not as strong in this particular case, but we do get a sense that if I utter 10, if Aslam trained harder, she would be stronger. This has this kind of implicature. She's not training really hard right now. Maybe she is not very likely to do so in the future, and I'll get back to that in a second. But let's stick with the temporal modal reference here first. So there are two basic approaches, and this is going to be hugely simplified for the purpose of the talk here, but there are two basic approaches to how to think about this. And one is the remoteness-based family of approaches that are based on the intuition that maybe simple past here doesn't really encode past, but what it encodes is a distance from the actual now, from the actual present. So maybe this form just says something like, it's either not this world or not this time right now. It has to be either another time or it has to be another world. And this is what we get, right? And this is illustrated by this very simplistic graph, right? But those were the early days, like in the 70s. I think Susanne Fleischmann might have been one of the first to propose this. This would be the picture that you get, basically a very, very broad definition, just an exclusion of the actual present, and that's it. And you can imagine that this would lead to overgeneralizations, right? And actually in this case, you should have this trained form should also be able to refer to the counterfactual past maybe, or anything else in this region, which it does not. So the, I think, strongest proponent of this line of approaches is Iatritu's 2000 paper, The Grammatical Ingredients of Counterfactuality. And there she does place additional restrictions on English simple past, for example, and how to interpret that, that do a good job of excluding most of the unattested readings. But then these restrictions turn out to be actually too strong and exclude also some of the readings that are in fact attested and okay. And that seems to be a problem that she cannot really get rid of, as it has been shown in later work. And the other family of approaches are backshifting approaches, and they usually rely on the branching time idea, the traditional branching time approach. So basically, here the idea is, if this is our actual present and we want to talk about the counterfactual past, present, future, what we have to do is shift our perspective backwards to a prior moment in time and then quantify forward. So this is illustrated by this graph. As you can see, without any further ado, this still creates a lot of bycatch. You would still be quantifying also over the possible future, over the actual present, over part of the actual past. One of the most prominent proponents of this line of work is Michaela Ippolito's work, for example, her 2013 book, where she takes care of those overgeneralizations and does place additional restrictions there to make sure we only get the attested readings. In my view, this line of approaches comes with two problems. One problem for me is that you need to do a lot of syntactic gymnastics, have very involved assumptions about the syntax-semantics interface, which to some of you might not be a really big problem, but I'm a simple-minded person. If I can get through my derivation from bottom to top just through predicate modification and functional application without a single movement or a zero category, then I'm happy. And you can definitely not do that with this family of approaches. There's a paper by Maribel Romero that explains why and does a very good job of doing so. And also, yeah, it's a good paper, but still I'm kind of bothered. And the other problem that I see with it is, or rather I don't see how these approaches derive the counterfactual interpretation of actually counterfactual conditionals and other counterfactual statements. And I haven't seen anyone really try. So most of these approaches have been bothered with basically deriving the temporal modal reference, but not so much deriving the counterfactual interpretation. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Let me just show you how I solve English simple past. So this would be the crudest version of remoteness-based approaches, just saying it's not, it's either not here, it's either not now or not this world. Backshifting approaches, saying we take a past perspective and then quantify forward. And in contrast to that, I can say very, very explicitly, English simple past refers to the actual past, but not the counterfactual past, and to the counterfactual present, and the counterfactual future, but not the possible future and not the actual present. And just make that a lexical definition. And that sits much better with the cross-linguistic variation that I actually find, because if you're going to derive all those restrictions just from pragmatic principles, you're going to have a much harder job accounting for cross-linguistic variation. And then I'm going to walk you through how to derive the counterfactual implicature very briefly, because that's also going to play a part in the next section. So the counterfactual implicature is much stronger in contexts referring to the past, as in 12. If Aisha had taken the train, she would have arrived at 3 p.m. Comes with the implicature, she did not take the train. I usually only say this if she did not take the train. It's only an implicature. We know this from Anderson conditionals such as 13, in a situation where we're trying to figure out what's wrong with Jones and what's the explanation for his symptoms. And someone says if Jones had taken arsenic, he would have shown exactly those symptoms, which he does in fact show. In that situation, we're likely to conclude, yeah, maybe he did take arsenic. So here we don't have a counterfactual implicature, despite the morphology. It's an implicature that arises in most contexts, but not all. So let's come up with a good context for 13. Let's assume that Q and A are trying to figure out when Aisha actually arrived today. And A knows that she did not take the train, but at some point she considered taking the 9 a.m. train to get here. And then Q asks, when did Aisha arrive? And I say, well, if she had taken the train, she would have arrived at 3 p.m. Then two things happen. A concludes first, she did not take the train, but A also concludes she still probably arrived around that time window. Maybe she still arrived around 3 p.m., right? Because that would be consistent with her initial plans. And in my view, what happens here is exactly the same as happens in 15, when I have a dress that my daughter has grown too tall for. I want to gift it to my niece Tracy. I don't know if it's going to fit her. I ask my husband, A, how tall is Tracy? And he says her identical twin Stacy is 1 meter tall. That's not what I asked. Like if I was being innocuous, I would say I didn't ask about Stacy. Right? I don't want to know this. He does not actually answer my question, but he does give me a good proxy, presumably, someone who's exactly the same age and maybe a similar build. And that's exactly what I do here, because the question is about actual indices. As in most situations, we want to know what did actually happen and not what happened in some counterfactual possible hypothetical scenario. We want to know what's actually the case, but if I cannot answer that question, then I might just give you a proxy and I can say, I can't tell you about the actual world, but I can tell you about this relevant counterfactual world that is probably a good enough proxy for us to still draw conclusions about the actual world. That's how we get those implicatures. Okay. Yeah, that's what I just said. Okay, so basically, I conclude that the English simple past encodes both counterfactuality and past and not other modal temporal references due to its lexical definition. And the counterfactuality implicature can be derived as a failure to address the question under discussion directly. Okay, I have a little time to go into the whole set of puzzles surrounding epistemic modality, the epistemic root distinction, and the weakness of epistemic must. So I'm going to talk briefly about those four following examples. 17 says Ezra must have been in her office. This gets an epistemic interpretation. Given what I know now, I have to conclude that she was in her office. By contrast, 18, everyone must go to their office now. This is not, oh, I think everyone will go to their office, but this is, everyone really has to go. There's a need, there is maybe a rule or something that people need to follow. Similar in 19, Ezra had to be in her office by 4. This also gets usually the interpretation. There was a rule, there was an order that she needed to be there. And this, of course, all contrasts with 20, where Ezra was in her office. This is just a statement of fact. Okay, so we have 2 issues that I'm gonna have to do. Oh no, I still have time. Sorry, I'm running through this. I still have time. Oh my God, breathe. Okay, oh, 15 minutes. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm just gonna do this again very, very slowly because you're all tired. Okay, so the first issue that we have to solve here is this epistemic root distinction. And if you have had anything to do with modal meanings, then you know that the proper way to classify them traditionally is to say you have a modal force that is either necessity, something must be the case or has to happen, or it's possibility, something can be the case, or might be the case, may be the case, or something can happen. And the other dimension along which we classify modal meanings is either modal flavor or modal bases and ordering sources. And when we talk about modal bases in the Kreitzerian tradition, the main distinction that we talk about here is really the epistemic, non-epistemic distinction. And epistemic means we're concerned with what we know. And root means, or non-epistemic is everything else, can have to do with a set of rules, can have to do with circumstances that allow for something to happen, make something possible. can have to do with a certain goal that we want to achieve. And that's like the basic distinction. It's also in the work by Einat Rubinstein, who has done corpus work on modal interpretations. And she had actually semanticists, trained semanticists, tag modal interpretations of expressions like must and have to in corpora. And one of the, in my view, most interesting things that she found is that semanticists disagree a lot on how they label those, how they tag those meanings. And one of the most stable distinctions is epistemic versus non-epistemic, at least with respect to past interpretations. So there we get clear judgments. Everything else, or mostly everything else, read her paper, but most other distinctions, and we can have very fine-grained ontologies of modal flavors and ordering sources, but those tend to be really hard to pin down and classify. And to me, that usually also means that they're probably not as real as some other distinctions. So I believe in the epistemic root distinction, and I'm going to show you how I derive that. And I think there's a lot of other things going on with other modal flavors, lots of interesting non-trivial stuff that I won't be able to address here, but that's really the one really stable distinction. And that's something that I think I can model just with my approach. Okay. So yeah, so we have the epistemic root distinction. And the other thing that is really weird and has been really puzzling to a lot of people is the weakness of must. As in, so if you contrast 17 with 20, Ezra must have been in her office versus Ezra was in her office. Must have been in her office sounds much weaker than Ezra was in her office. If I say Ezra was in her office, then I'm like just committed to that. That means I know this. When I say Ezra must have been in her office, that's like hedging. It indicates I actually do not have, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I don't have direct evidence for that. And that is weak. That is weird, given that in all available accounts, including mine, must is a quantification of a world that includes the actual world, and 20 should follow from 17. So it's logically stronger, but it still gets a much weaker interpretation. So that's the second puzzle. But let's return to the epistemic root distinction here. So the way I think about these cases, and I'm just repeating the examples without repeating the numbers. I hope that's okay. So for example, in a case like everyone must go to their office now, what happens is very simply a universal quantification over possible futures. So in all relevant futures, everyone goes to their office, and then I have to figure out what does she mean by relevant. And so maybe she means in all the worlds that conform to the rules, or that conform to the necessities of the situation, that will be the case, right? And by contrast, when I say Ezra must have been in her office, I think what happens here is this is your actual present, and then you look back, and then you quantify over both the actual and the counterfactual world, and say in all those, in the relevant temporal interval, Ezra is in her office. And given what I said before, language gives us the option of only just quantifying over actual indices, or only quantifying over counterfactual indices. And why would you not just do that? Why would you not just only ever talk about the actual world? Because who is actually interested in those, right? Doesn't matter. But yeah, so that's what we have to figure out then. And what the conversation partners then conclude is, usually in most contexts, maybe we're not able to distinguish between those two with respect to the relevant proposition. So basically, I think epistemic modality is in essence an ignorance inference, an ignorance implicature. Epistemic modality is what you get when you quantify over both actual and counterfactual indices. And I'm going to show you I'm going to modify that slightly to integrate earlier insights by Cleo Condarafti into that framework and integrate something like a temporal perspective. So then when we contrast Ezra must have been in her office, where we get the epistemic interpretation, with Ezra had to be in her office by 4, essentially in both cases we're quantifying over the same domain is what I think happens, but relative to different perspectives, basically. So in one case, I'm here, this is my actual present, and this is also my topic time. And I look backward and then quantify over both the actual and counterfactual. And what I do in cases like Ezra had to be in her office is I take the perspective of the reference or topic time going back and then quantify forward. And seen from here, there's no actual and counterfactual branches. Seen from here, there's only possible futures. So we can modify the statement by saying epistemic modality is quantification over both actual and counterfactuality, counterfactual indices relative to the topic time or the reference time. Here I take a past perspective and quantify forward. And here I take the present perspective and quantify backward. And this is essentially actually just what Cleo Condarafti says in her 2002 paper about modals for the past and modals for the present. So yeah, so getting to the weakness of must then, and this, if you've followed me so far, which I understand if you haven't, at least here it's hot and we're all tired, but if you followed me so far, then the weakness of must in a way just falls out of what I just said. So again, the puzzle is when I say Ezra must be in her office, this logically implies that Ezra is in her office. This is a logically stronger statement. It gets an interpretation of epistemic necessity. Traditionally, what this means is that in all worlds that are compatible with the speaker's knowledge, Ezra is in her office. But the commitment by the speaker to Ezra being in her office is, in the case of must be in her office, it's a much weaker commitment, right? Now, this is a long-standing puzzle. I just picked out 2 previous analyses, the Fintel and Gillies one, where basically they say must carries an evidential signal. It says something like, I don't have direct evidence for this. A more recent one is by Dan Lasseter, who proposes a new model that embeds an existing scalar theory into a probabilistic model of informational dynamics structured around questions and answers, and I still don't fully know what that means, so I'm not going to paraphrase it any more than that, but it's kind of, it seems kind of involved, and I'm really a simple-minded person, so I like simple answers to difficult puzzles. So the way I see it is that, again, like with the counterfactuals, most of the time, in most situations, we're not concerned with all possibilities, and we're not concerned with counterfactual worlds at all. We want to know what is actually the case. So a sentence like Ezra must be in her office, this is a likely answer to a question such as where is Ezra, or is Ezra in her office, something like that. No, not where must Ezra be. In fact, for where must Ezra be, you'd have to have a very, very specific context for this question to be even okay to ask and sound kind of felicitous, right? So, so most of the time we would have a context that says, where's Ezra? Is she in her office? And then you might say Ezra must be in her office. And what I do here again is I quantify over both the actual present and counterfactual indices. So the question is about this, and what I answer is this. And then I go with my analogies, and to me, this is exactly analogous to 27, where the question is, did Georgia smoke after dinner yesterday? And someone says, Georgia always smokes after dinner yesterday. Logically, this is stronger. If she always smokes after dinner, then she did smoke after dinner yesterday. And still, it seems like a lesser commitment compared to, yes, she did smoke after dinner yesterday, right? And I think this is, again, because it's not a direct answer to the problem, to the question. My question is about yesterday, and I just universally quantify over all dinners that Georgia has. So I failed to directly address that question. And again, I get some kind of ignorance implicature. So maybe you do not have direct evidence specifically about yesterday. And I think exactly the same happens with must. So yeah, basically it's a violation of conversational conventions. It's a violation of Gricean maxims. And so I get an inference, and what I typically get in these situations is an inference of ignorance. Okay, so wrapping this up, utterances with must are a bit similar to counterfactuals conditionals. They're not exactly the same, because in counterfactual conditionals, I only talk about counterfactual indices. With must, I talk about both actual and counterfactual ones, but it's similar in that they both usually fail to address the question under discussion. And this is because most QEDs are about the actual world. Must refers to both actual and counterfactual worlds. So I get the inference of epistemic uncertainty or indirect evidence. Wrapping this up, what is modality? I think modality is any quantification over non-actual indices, possible indices, counterfactual indices, plus actual indices. Whenever you do that, you get a modal meaning. And in contexts that are concerned with actual indices, which is most contexts, modal expressions create inferences. So, and then we get, for example, the counterfactual implicature when we only quantify over counterfactual indices, and we get an ignorance implicature when we quantify over both actual and counterfactual indices. And this is how this whole thing is actually just really one thing, and it's all connected. Okay, that's all the time I have. Thanks.
We have about 13 minutes for questions once the applause is faded down. Vera?
Hi, Kilu. Thank you for your talk. I have two questions for you. So I think one might probably be answered if with more technical details. So how do you derive that when we use past in English or many languages, the fake past interpretation is very restricted in the environments it can show up, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, what restricts, in a way you have the opposite problem to the other approaches. Why is it that so often past is actually only looking at the actual world?
That's a great question, of course. Yeah, my answer to that question, conveniently though, is basically the same as Sabine Iatrido's answer to that question, which is pragmatic principles.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's like, that has to be, and that's also, I think, mirrored in Anne Mucha's work, for example, on just default interpretations of temporal markers. Tense aspect modality markers, like if they have a pretty wide definition and you can, like in a context where you can make it only about the actual world, then make it only about the actual world. And I would say that in counterfactual conditionals in English, for example, it's usually the would, for example, that kind of forces it to go in that direction, because otherwise you would get trivially false or trivially true statements, stuff like that. So that can't be true. So then you have to kind of make it about counterfactual indices. But this is really, so this is about pragmatic defaults, which I think if you look at tenseless languages, if you look at any other underspecified kinds of tense aspect markers, then if you can make it about the actual word, make it about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Your answer to my second question might actually be the same. Could you go back to slide 28, where you kind of looked at the Iatrido ambiguity and the different derivations of that one?
Right.
I think it's one more slide back, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So what rules are kind of intermediate readings where I take as the temporal perspective I mean, are we forced to take one of these endpoints as the temporal perspective of the modal statement, or are intermediate readings available under this model?
Yeah, okay. So here, conveniently, I have really the same answer as Counterfactual. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of people who had basically the right answers to a lot of those questions. And Counterfactual gets actually more than one interpretation for like both, I think. So she gets a deontic interpretation for the must case and also an epistemic interpretation for some have-to cases. And so I think you can, under the right conditions, you can kind of force the other reading. I don't think it's something intermediate necessarily, but you can kind of, the context can force you to switch between the two. And I don't have a very strong opinion about how that happens. There's different people would have different answers to that. Like this epistemic reading for had to in the past, she had to be in her office, like in a novel, you can get that, or she just had to be there, right? So Maribel Romero, for example, would tell you that the entire text has a past marker just scoping over the whole thing, stuff like that. So, or you could go like, there's a rescue interpretation for that situation. I don't really have strong feelings about how exactly to derive that, but I think it's clear that it's the context that kind of forces one reading or the other usually. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mitcho?
So thank you so much. I have a question, but I first need like vocabulary because this is not a world of a set of problems I think about. So in your formalization, which we don't need to go back to, but you use two relations. So one is just the less than, and one is the less than and equal to, and one is time, and one is some kind of causal precedence or something. What do you call them?
No, okay. No. Oh yeah, so sorry. Yeah, I should totally have commented on that, and I'm going back to the formalization. In fact, it's just wait a second.
It was the first.
Yeah, I have a problem with my screen here. I peeked at the participants, and now I can't disappear them again. Here we go. I think no. Okay, yeah. Anyway, so I don't see my own slides, but I think
if it's useful, it was, I'm thinking of like slide 15. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, exactly. No, the precedence relation really, it only means is a predecessor to, and that means on the same line. It's before that. It's before that on the same line, or it's identical to it in the case.
So that's written less than or equal to.
Yes.
And then the less than is just temporal ordering. Is that right? Oh no.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I forgot that. So less than or equal to means predecessor or identical to. Less than just means predecessor, and all of this means in this branching structure. None of this. I mean, if you mean by temporal, this is all temporal, but I think actually of it as modal. So I think of indices as kind of world-time pairs because this is a two-dimensional structure, and I assume that we have a superimposed complete temporal order on that. So yeah, I forgot that point. That's a super important point. Sorry. So in the graph, vertically stacked indices are simultaneous. Okay. So you have kind of a superimposition of a linear temporal order. You can group indices according to whether they're simultaneous or not. I cannot model utterances such as if time was slower than it actually is. I cannot do that. I don't care. But if that's what you want to do, don't do this.
No, but, okay. So okay, that helps me. So if we go one slide further, I mean, I was trying to reconstruct how you get the worlds that are, future oriented or now or future oriented versus the the counterfactual past. So now I understand. You also have a separate temporal relation.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes.
okay,
Sorry,
that's fine.
super
No.
important. Yeah.
But so now my actual question, if I'm not taking too much time, is
Yeah.
Are there languages, or could we imagine a language where you really don't have temporal reference at all, right? I mean, I could sort of vaguely imagine a language where you only have this kind of precedence, really. Realis language, right? But basically it's like either you're certain of it or not, period. So like looking at this diagram, you would collapse sort of, I mean, a lot of the dotted gray and the gray, right? So like, it doesn't matter, like if it hasn't happened, if it's counterfactual, if it's counterfactual, it doesn't matter if it actually was past or future temporarily, you can't distinguish that. It's just not real.
Yeah.
Does it?
Absolutely. I mean, and there are definitely irrealis languages where realis is really just actual present and past, and irrealis is everything else.
Okay.
Right? Like, I think there are languages like that. I haven't actually seen any of them described in sufficient detail to tell you for sure, but I think Nanti is a very good candidate for a language like that, where it also interacts with polarity and stuff, but basically, yeah, realis is the actual past and present, irrealis is everything else. I haven't seen a three-way distinction yet that would really completely align with this, but then I don't think anyone has ever tried to make their language fit that model, so that could also be a factor. Yeah, theoretically it's possible, and we definitely do have these mood prominent languages where really the modal distinction is much more important than any temporal distinction. Yeah.
I see. Yes.
What we saw with the, yeah, sorry.
No, well, so I was wondering what this language would look like, and it would be one where, like, one of the crucial things would be you would not distinguish a counterfactual past from something which is a possible future.
Exactly. So this is, or a counterfactual future for that matter, which
Sure.
in my model exists. Other people are like, counterfactual futures don't exist because there is no factual future. I don't have that problem of possible futures and counterfactual futures, right? Anyway, this is what we did. Like, this is exactly the fine-grained mapping that you can do. And this is where we developed stimuli to see with the Vanuatu languages, how temporal are they? How modal are they? And we saw a lot of variation between the individual languages. None of them were purely modal and none of them were purely temporal. They all found kind of a, oh yeah, with the future, I'm gonna go with a temporal alignment, and with the past, I'm gonna go with a reality alignment, reality-based alignment and stuff. So I haven't seen a super clear-cut picture that only favors one dimension over the others in that region, at least. But yeah, definitely look up our storyboards if you're interested in that, because they allow you to exactly get, oh, counterfactual future, counterfactual past, possible future, and contrast all these meanings. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So our final question is from Hiroki. Should I read it, or would you like to?
My question is simple. So are you referring to a clash with the QUD at a couple of places, and I wonder whether the QUD you set up was, how did you get that QUD?
Right. So yeah, good question. Thanks. I just, whenever we talk, so the entire traditional literature about conditionals will give you the conditional and no context. And I find that super problematic because when I start thinking about QEDs, I can come up with a bunch of them. And depending on the QED, I come up with different interpretations of the conditionals. So what I gave you is really just one plausible scenario out of several. And actually there are scenarios where you would get different interpretations, where like the best explanation for choosing the counterfactual conditional in this case would maybe not be that it's similar to the actual present or something like that. There might be other inferences. I talk more about this in my paper, in my linguistics and philosophy paper. where I tried to come up with a few factors, like, are you trying to figure out this? Are you trying to figure out that? That was just one example, like one plausible context where this could arise and where we can see how we derive the inferences. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.